I think we've been looking at clerics all wrong for a long time, and we're going to talk about it today. I'm Tristan. This is Heroes and Homebrew. So when we think about clerics in D&D, we usually think about their healing powers. And yes, they can turn undead, but when a party needs a cleric or asks for someone to play a cleric, it's so that they have a healer. Now, in older editions of D&D, this could be very useful because there was not a lot of healing around, and a magic user who could heal was great. In more recent editions, in like 5e, almost every spellcaster has healing of some sort. You have your short rests that allow you to heal. You have your long rests that heal all your hit points in one night. So, is the cleric as a healer really that necessary, especially even with the abundance of healing potions out there? I don't think so. So, I was on the Discord for Hex Press. I hang out there sometimes and talk about stuff. And he posted a blog post that really got me thinking of how we should be looking at clerics. So we're going to take a look at that, and I'm going to tell you what my thoughts are and how I think we should be looking at clerics from this point on. Okay, so this is a blog post called The Gothic Film in OD&D. And basically it is describing how OD&D is largely based on Gothic horror. Yes, a lot of it is accurate, and it made me think about how to approach OD&D in the future. But what I really want to look at is the cleric and how we can use the cleric as a much more interesting class in Dungeons and Dragons. So this blog is called Roll to Doubt. I'll post a link in the description below. It starts off with, whether due to Appendix N being the popular melange of fiction considered key to understanding old D&D's genre emulation or other reasons, discussion of the 1974 rules seems to bypass their debt to Gothic movie cycles a lot. It's one thing to recognize OD&D's origins in the Blackmore campaign and give passing note to the cheesy horror movies Arneson watched on a given weekend, very likely The Strangler of Blackmore Castle, makes sense. Quite another to read the booklets as a document that emerges in that period of Gothic revival in popular film, between the accession of Hammer, Dark Shadows, and others. Hammer, if you don't know, is the producer of Gothic horror movies, often featuring Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, all those actors. Gothic old D&D has been practiced from tales of the grotesque and dungeonesque to ghastly affair and many others. I'm interested in seeing how much of the writing in the original booklets evokes these movies by themselves, if briefly, as I prepare a campaign around it. So, the author's preparing a campaign sort of dedicated to Gothic horror. And the argument could be made that OD&D is a horror game. It's violent, there's grotesque creatures, but at the same time you can use OD&D to emulate many different types of fantasy. Now this is what made me really think, is how he describes the cleric here. The cleric, famously Peter Cushing's Van Helsing and Hammer's Dracula features, but under Gothic film setting assumptions, stands as an integral catch-all for every Puritan witch hunter in the genre. Also Solomon Kane. So right there we have the clerics they're holy people, and basically going after anything that is unholy. Often removed from campaigns due to gamey reasons. I've never seen clerics being told they're not allowed to be played in a campaign, but maybe this author has other experiences. Keeping the undead scary, keeping the fighter's niche in armor use, not wanting to deal with the metaphysical implications, etc. Argued to not fit OD&D. I don't really understand who could argue that, considering it's one of the only classes. An argument that only holds water if one assumes the booklets as just sword and sorcery emulation, likely due to low familiarity with such movies. Yeah, a lot of people do say, "Oh, OD&D is sword and sorcery," and it absolutely can be used that way. And that if you are going to lean towards more sword and sorcery, then yeah, the cleric maybe is not a class that you would want involved, because if you look at Conan and things like that, there's no clerics really. Demand for non-edged weapons is an awkward inclusion to protect fighters' niche, often interpreted as bad historical work regarding religious practices. I've personally never been a fan of clerics not being allowed to use edged weapons. I like the idea of them being able to use bows and crossbows and swords. I do kind of get it though. Like, if you let the cleric use swords, then what's the point of the fighter? Although the fighter gets the extra abilities to go along with it and make them better at using swords. But that's neither here nor there. Cleric fits no historical understanding of Christianity, but the very pop Christianity of Gothic movies, whether produced by Protestants or Catholics. A functional Christianity that exists as a recognizable prop for a game because vampires in movies fear the cross, law and chaos become Christianity and Satanism. Okay, fair enough. But you can create your fantasy version of that. There's any number of ways that you can create it so that vampires aren't just, fearing the cross. They can fear any holy symbol based on your pantheon of gods or what have you. It's not an insurmountable issue. The human limitation for clerics also reflects well the Puritan intolerance and establishing of the human as sacred and the inhuman as impure in my eyes. Alternatives to the clerics still within Gothic movie OD&D: turn undead, available to all. Turn undead as a fighter power, assumes the role as witch hunter figure. Detect evil represents the cliche movie sense of the hunter of evil entering a place and saying, "I sense evil." I think basically the author is saying that he's going to, looks like he's removing the cleric from his Gothic OD&D or reworking it. However, if we rethink the cleric and say the cleric is not the holy healer that we've always used it as, but this machine of undead hunting, then you start to get a sense that you can use it in a very different way. Yes, they're always good at fighting, they wear heavy armor and whatnot, but you can have a very interesting cleric character who is propelled by this sense of holiness that is pushing against the darkness of the undead. You could create a campaign that is just almost pure horror or Gothic horror, like to have that sense of it, and the cleric playing a Van Helsing type character. You can adjust it so that, yes, they can use edged weapons, they can use crossbows, so that you have less of this healer sort of holy man and more of a warrior of a D&D. Now, if we go a little further and we look at the bestiary he adds into this, it begins to give you that sense of like, okay, yeah, like this is OD&D. If you strip away some of the more fantastical things, then you have a very sort of dark Gothic game. The specific presence of silver-tipped arrows, garlic wolfsbane, 2 kinds of cross, and holy water among equipment does suggest that they are expected to be regularly used, and therefore the hunting of vampires, werewolves, and such are major activities that will be undertaken in the campaign. And these things are in all versions of D&D. You have the silver-tipped arrows, you have... OD&D has got the wooden cross and the metal cross, or silver cross, I think it is. But you can change that to just any holy symbol if you don't want to if you don't want your campaign to be like connected to sort of modern real world religions. And so you get the sense, okay, well, we should be gearing towards that like fighting against the undead and against the horrors of the world. The mirror itself may be another addition to recognize hidden vampires besides harming them, and it may have been included in in those grounds before its now classic function to spy into another room. So it's got that dual purpose. Everyone talks about the mirror being like, oh, I can see around corners and whatnot, but you can also use it to detect vampires. So I think as the game evolved over years, the use for these items changed. And if you look at it like this, it kind of says like, okay, well, are we playing D&D the way it was intended? And the answer is yes. We were playing the D&D the way it was intended because it's intended to be played however you want to play it. But there are certain things that sort of their use evolved throughout the course of time to where I think nowadays we don't look at it as maybe what its original intended use was. While much has been written about the weird pricing in the list, the specific function of garlic in a Gothic campaign would justify expensiveness as a game resource. Again, garlic could be another resource against fighting the undead, against fighting vampires. And if you run out of garlic, then you're not protecting yourself as much. The potion of longevity among magic items matches the liquid required for sustained survival and youth and hammers the man who could cheat death. Now, I've watched some of the Hammer movies, and some of them are really good. If you like those old 40s, 50s, 60s horror movies, the Hammer movies are a good go-to. I used to love watching the old Universal horror movies, the old Dracula and Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, The Creature from the Black Lagoon. I used to love those movies. Even when I was a kid and I was watching them in black and white, like it was the 80s, and I still loved watching them. And of course that led me to watching Monster Squad, which was great. Evil high clerics and their strongholds matched the satanic cults present in many such movies. For example, the adaptation of The Devil Rides Out. Hammer also produced a horror film around Rasputin that could serve as inspiration. So again, you have the evil high clerics. Maybe the evil high clerics are the ones raising undead or creating cults around these vampires or what have you. And you have the cleric, which is the only source of light against fighting these guys. So that reading this article or this blog post, I started to really think of like, I think we could use the cleric in such a much more interesting way than just the heal bot, you know? The undead are classically silent in the movies. The transition to sound cinema was required to make that detail stand out. So one can attribute it to White Zombie, but it's fair to say that undead in silent film also act as such to sneak upon others, Nosferatu as a classic example. Not a mechanic that comes from antagonistic GMing, but genre emulation. The undead, maybe they're not always silent, like completely silent. Vampires for sure absolutely could be completely silent. Ghosts could be completely silent, but maybe like your zombies have those shuffling sounds, just like scraping. And there's a GM who can describe those sounds, saying like down the hallway you hear is a shuffling or like the sound of nails clicking on the floor. You're not only are you projecting what might be down there, but you're also building that sense of tension and you're building the atmosphere within the game. The undead as under the command of priests and sorcerers, of course, ties back to zombie films pre-Romero. It's very interesting. Encounters with animals such as wolves and rats serve as a prompt for the GM to include a nearby vampire or werewolf. Again, all this stuff leads to creating this world of fighting the undead and the horrific, the supernatural. While not Gothic, the Blob serves as a comparison to the gelatinous monsters as well as Hammer's X the Unknown, which itself was related to Hammer's Quartermass film adaptations in production. Although the source for the Medusa was probably just myth directly, Hammer's The Gorgon is a coincidental inclusion of that figure in Gothic film. The town encounter table suggests that undead will be a common encounter, which matches the vampire invasions or evil priest conducting summoning of ghosts and zombies that are standard in those movies as common narrative situations for the game. And that's something I always thought was weird when you look at the encounter table for an urban environment. It has undead on there, and I was like, why would there, why would that be possible? Like, you're in an urban environment, there shouldn't be undead around. But if it's a possible regular occurrence, then you're creating this world where the undead are ever present and they need people to fight against them. Clerics in OD&D don't have any spells at first level, but they have turn undead, and they can turn zombies at first level. So, again, it sort of makes me think that like maybe the clerics should be the stars of the game and not, the background characters. Although not Gothic, an extraordinary amount of the bestiary can be recreated just using Hammer's non-horror film movies, especially their films in the Lost World genre or dealing with alien threats. Yes, there's a lot in the bestiary of OD&D that is not supernatural or Gothic. You have the classic fantasy creatures, you got goblins and orcs, but there's a lot there that could be. Even like the jellies and whatnot, those could be considered supernatural or what have you, just like the blob. You could create a gelatinous cube that expands the more it eats. And then finally, the game concepts. The Angry Villagers rule specifically mentions horror cinema, and the presence of angry villagers is commonly Gothic. Think Frankenstein, pitchforks, and torches. Castles, manors, ruins, and tombs, including mummies with its traps, in Gothic film offer a much more immediate reference of dungeon crawling than efforts in tying the gameplay to pulp, sword, and sorcery, even though predecessors also feature there. Many an Italian Gothic movie will be centered around a dungeon under a castle and the terrible rites and tortures that happen there. Stuck doors are recurrent in such films as a way of building suspense as a character tries to run from a monster. Also stucking the door to prevent entrance of monster in chases. Secret doors and tunnels are also a nearly obligatory feature with possible inspiration from the adaptation of The Phantom of the Opera. Monsters always perfect sight in the dungeon's darkness, and any door opening for them matches the genre convention in horror movies of the monster suddenly appearing and detecting the enemy. It would be a stretch to connect the monster's tendency to give up pursuit after turning a corridor with the "I think we lost them" recurrent scene. Attention with light, the carrying of torches and candles is a staple in those explorations, as well as the slow speed of movement to avoid calling the attention of evil threats. So that's it. It's a pretty short article, but it made me think of how you could really run OD&D and the cleric in really using the cleric to its full potential, which is something I don't think we do often. So there you have it. The cleric is not just a healer. The cleric is a warrior for a deity that is cleansing the earth of the undead and supernatural. And when used correctly, in conjunction with using some of the ideas in OD&D that create this sort of Gothic horror vibe, then you can really use the cleric to its full potential. Maybe, like I would give the cleric an edged weapon and let them use a short sword, maybe, or something like that. Certainly allow them to use a crossbow or bow. Silver-tipped arrows would be so useful for a cleric, especially if you were to want to run like a solo game as just with a cleric who is traveling the country and fighting the undead. Silver-tipped arrows would be super useful. So again, when you think about it in these terms, then the Van Helsing movie with Hugh Jackman is an actually reasonable view of how you could play a cleric and make it super interesting. Besides just we need a cleric because we need to heal, and we need a cleric so he can call upon his god to help us out. Clerics could be so much more. They could be so much more interesting if put in the right context and used to their full potential. So I hope maybe that gave you something to think about. And even in newer editions of D&D, I think a lot of this still holds true. You can still use a cleric to its full potential. Although I understand that now, like in 5e, yes, there's so many different types of clerics you could play. But if you're playing older versions, BX, OD&D, even AD&D, you can really make them super interesting. So that's it for me. Save a seat for me at your table.